Hello everybody, my name is Nicole Tipple and I am a professional Magic the Gathering player. Today I want to kind of introduce a new set of content, and that has to do with preparation and improving at Magic and getting what you want out of Magic the Gathering. And so, what are my credentials? I qualified for my first Pro Tour in February of last year at my first regional championship. I had only played the format for about 2 weeks, and I think I got a little bit lucky in both my deck selection, but also how I decided to approach that preparation given the amount of time that I had. And since I qualified for my first Pro Tour, I've managed to do continuously well at events. I qualified for Worlds last year, and I'm qualified for just about as many Pro Tours as I can be now. And I attribute a lot of my success to both the people I get to work with, but also to tournament prep. How I learn formats, how I pick decks, and how I kind of do that preparation, metagaming, all of that, those things before the tournament happens at all. I think a huge portion of how well you would do at a tournament is related to the work that you do before the tournament. And so today I want to take you through some of the things that I do before tournaments. So just a little overview of this video. We're going to talk first about setting goals. I think that's important. Then we're going to talk about learning the format for whatever tournament you're going to be playing at. Then we'll talk about narrowing in on a deck. We'll talk about choosing your list, and then kind of how we go about practicing and playing that deck as best as we can. Obviously, these are all things that work pretty well for constructed tournaments. If you're interested in hearing a little bit more about prep for limited tournaments, be sure to let me know in the comments, but they don't do a whole lot of those, and they just ran one in Denver, and so I think that might be one we can talk about a little bit down the line. But given the regional championship in Minneapolis is happening next weekend, I want to share a little bit about how I prep for it and what I'm going to be doing over the next week to achieve my goals at this event. So the first thing I want to talk about, and arguably one of the most important, is setting realistic goals for yourself. At my first event, my goal was to win a match. It was the regional championship in Denver, and I had never played Modern before in a room full of enfranchised Magic players, and so I just wanted to win a match. That was my same goal at my first Pro Tour. Now, when I go to events, my goals are a little bit different. I'm qualified for the next couple of Pro Tours, and so, for example, this weekend, my goal is to approach an area that I may be a little bit weaker in, a style of deck. So as I go into prep, I'm going to try to be working on skills that I may be not as strong at and get a good grasp and understanding of the standard metagame before the Pro Tour that's happening in June, Final Fantasy. If your goal, a big goal of a lot of people here is probably to qualify for the Pro Tour. And so as we think about those goals, those are going to kind of align what we do throughout the rest of prep and how we, decide what decks we want to play and things of those nature, and kind of figure out what we want to work on. And so I think one of the biggest things to do is, I think it sounds cheesy, but take a little notepad out, type it on your computer, write down your goals for the next event you're going to, and kind of try to refer to that whenever you're thinking about where you are going to go with the next part of your prep. All right, so this tournament we have a little bit of an easier time when it comes to determining what the meta looks like, where we should kind of start our focus when we're trying to learn a new format. We had the regional championship in Europe last weekend, and so I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at the data from this event with you and talking about how I kind of interpret that and how I use that when I decide what decks I'm going to be looking at and what deck inevitably I will play for the tournament. Now, before we look at this, I want to mention that in the terms of data, this sample size is very small. So it's important not to prioritize the fact that, there's a 55.8% win rate here and that Jeskai Oculus is a percent under that. That doesn't necessarily mean prowess is going to be, that much better than Jeskai Oculus. But to look at, the data, it should be used as a guideline more than strict numbers. Data is very useful, but we need to infer from the data and kind of use that to come to our own conclusions, because the sample sizes are a little bit too small to get conclusive data. So, when I start my prep, I'm going to look at probably, the top 8, 9, 10 decks or something, and I'm going to start looking at lists for those decks, learning them, seeing how they play, and I'm going to kind of compare those to the last time I played the format. So Domain Overlords won the last Pro Tour. It appears to have had a worse performance this weekend, with a couple of pretty bad matchups, it looks like. And the other decks that were pretty popular at that event, Gruul Mice, Mono Red Aggro, and Esper Pixie, all are sitting pretty far down this like win rate chart here. And so, maybe at some point we'll talk about looking at why that happened. That being said, there's a couple of breakout decks of this tournament. Is It Prowess is a new deck featuring Corey Steelcutter. Jeskai Oculus, not a new deck, but got a lot of new cards in Tarkir. Jeskai Control is a deck that is playing Shiko, a dragon from the new set. And the Azorius Omniscience deck looks completely different than it did pre-Tarkir, with a couple of new cards added. And we can see those all did pretty well at this tournament. So I'll probably start by looking at those decks. And I'm going to spend some time looking at this matchup spread section here. It looks like, for example, Is It Prowess has a pretty good Mono Red Aggro matchup. And I think all of these are data points that we should confirm for ourselves because they are pretty small sample sizes. But we can use these kind of as a guide for how we start looking at the format and the decks and the matchups and things like that. I would be darned if I didn't mention it, but because we did have regional championship data, I decided to look at that data instead. But the other place that you can typically go to get an idea of what the metagame is, start looking at decks, picking them up, things of said nature, is Magic the Gathering Online. A lot of the tournament meta, especially in franchise players, tend to follow the Magic the Gathering Online data, and so you can contribute, a lot of percentages and things to have similar numbers to Magic the Gathering Online. And so this is the Super Showcase qualifier from the weekend. It was another big tournament. And so, I spent some time looking through these decks, considering playing them, looking at the lists, maybe new cards people were playing, and things like that to kind of get an idea for the format and what decks and things I should be trying. So this is the melee.gg post for the European Regional Championship this weekend. This was the tournament software that they used. And here you can see the standings for the event, the players and how well they did, their deck lists. You can also see a couple other cool things. So as an example, I'm going to look at this one Jeskai Control player here. They're the only Jeskai Control player in the top 32. So when I start looking at Jeskai Control, I'll probably look at this list. But you can also go down and you can see their tournament path. This is pretty cool. You can see all of the people they played in the tournament and what decks they played, and you can see which matches they won or lost. And this is pretty useful because it can kind of show, hey, this person with this deck did really well, but maybe they didn't play a lot of this bad matchup or something like that. So this is a pretty cool feature that melee.gg offers, and I think it's pretty useful. So I wanted to make sure I showed you guys that. So now that we've looked at the decks that were played, we've started playing some games, getting an idea for what they play for, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I start narrowing down to the deck that I want to play. So there is only so much time that any human has to prep for these events. Most people that play Magic don't do it full time. It is a passion for a lot of people, and so, we have jobs and things to do, and we're busy people. And so I like to make the most out of my time. For me, that means that instead of, jamming ladder constantly in a way where I'm maybe not making the most progress towards what I think the best choice will be, instead I spend some time, in a testing server with my friends, finding, working with people that are like-minded and coming to conclusions together. That might mean that, if I have a friend that I know has played one of these decks a lot, that I ask for their game log reviews or, videos of them playing and ask them about their decisions. And so I can kind of start off on a baseline for, how good all of these decks are, how well, I'm playing them, and can use that to get a grasp of how I feel like that deck's meta perception is based off of our plan. Like if we sideboard differently, or maybe we expect more of this deck than another deck. And so I try to utilize other people and efficient testing practices as much as I can. there are a lot of Discords, if you go on Twitter and you look around, of different groups that will work together for the regional championships of people that are like-minded that also want to do well at these events. And if that is something you're interested in, I suggest trying to find one. Without going too far into detail of what me and my friends are doing for this event, because those secrets are not only mine, they're other people's, and I don't want to go, sharing all of the hard work they're doing. I will talk a little bit now about how I narrow the deck and what processes I take to kind of become an expert at that deck. One of the biggest things you should know is that deck comfort is frequently more important than playing the best deck in the room. When you go to an event, if you're not going to play the deck well, it doesn't matter how good it is. Magic's hard, and playing optimally is always a little bit more important. And so once I decide, what deck I think might be well positioned at a tournament, I start playing a lot with it. We have meetings where we discuss mulligan decisions, who's keeping this hand on 6, or who's mulliganing this hand on the draw against this deck on 5, or things like that that are useful to kind of see how other people are approaching things. Maybe other key points, decision points in the game where you feel like, this turn really mattered. Was there something else I could have done here to maybe win a game that I lost, or something like that? And we spend a lot of time looking at those situations and kind of trying to focus on key points in games that we can improve on so that we play the deck as best as possible at the tournament that we are going to. A big part of what I do is I look at game log reviews. I have 17 lands on for all of these games, and so when I'm testing with my friends, maybe then afterwards I will look at the review. We'll talk about what we could have done differently, and how, presuming the games were played perfectly, what we think would have happened and things like that. I am going to have a segment on the channel sometime this week with Ryan Condon where we are going to kind of give you a showcase of what this looks like. Obviously, we can't put hours and hours of prep into one video, but we're going to play a match, and then we're going to kind of look at the review and talk about what we possibly could have done differently, and kind of give you guys an overview of how we approach those situations. And so, once I've narrowed down on a deck for the tournament, I want to really, really become an expert at it. Now that I've decided what deck I'm going to play, I'm not saying I'm going to play Is It Prowess, but now that I've decided what deck that I'm going to play, the next thing I want to do is I want to decide what my 75 is going to look like. Which cards I want over other cards, your deck selection, but specifically the cards in your deck can be tailored to the metagame you're anticipating at your event. And so what I'm going to do next is I have, again, this melee.gg from the European RC. I took Is It Prowess because it did very well at the event, and there were several decks in the top 8 and under that. And I'm going to compare some of these Is It Prowess lists so that I have, a set of notes if I'm testing this deck on what cards I should try, maybe, what cards people played in different quantities, what cards impressed, what cards maybe, didn't reach up to their expectations, so that I can play the most optimized version of the deck that I can. And I can kind of improve it and try these things throughout all of this other time that I am, becoming an expert at my deck. So for an example, we've got a couple of Is It Prowess decks here. This one seems, pretty streamlined. It's got 4 of most of the cards, and then cards they chose to play in small quantities. They chose to play 2 into the Flood Maw and 1 Spell Pierce. And we could look at some sideboard options too, but for now let's look at the main decks just to get an idea. So, maybe I want to try a Spell Pierce in the main deck. So let's look what else we've got. This is another Is It Prowess deck, and this one looks like it's playing a couple of different cards. This one's playing 3 Monastery Swiftspear instead of 4. So maybe they think that this one's not quite as good. It's playing 2 Ren's Resolve, so maybe that's a card I would consider playing. They're playing some Torch the Towers in the main deck, a slightly different split on cards, and so, maybe this is another kind of configuration I could try. And this deck is playing Thundertrap Trainer, and this town ain't big enough. Maybe this is another style of the deck that I want to try. And so I'll go through a couple of the decks, find key cards, and kind of decide which cards I want to try so that I can come down to my final 75 that I decide to play in the event. All right, so you've been prepping for your event, you've been playing, you've been trying to utilize your time well, you picked a deck that you thought was going to be good for achieving your goals at the event. And so now I'm going to give you a couple of tips and tricks from, both me, but some of my friends. I asked a group of my friends what they thought were like the most important pieces of advice they could give to people prepping for events, and we got a couple of good ones. So Jason said the biggest piece of advice it could give is to approach practice intentionally. Always ask yourself, what are you trying to accomplish here? I think that is a super useful piece of advice. We do that all of the time in testing. So I'll give an example. We were at Worlds and we were trying to, we had come to the conclusion that we were probably going to play this Otters deck, that it was going pretty well, that we liked the way it played, but we were specifically struggling with the mono red matchup, like against these aggressive leyline decks, which we thought might have been involved in the tournament. And so, we played a set of matches where we wanted to accomplish improving our win rate against red. When I sit down for testing for this event, maybe, let's use the top two decks. Is it Prowess and Jeskai Oculus? This says that Is It Prowess is slightly unfavored based off of this small sample size. So maybe we'll play some of that matchup. Maybe there's different sideboard configurations Is It Prowess can do to up its win rate. Maybe there are things Jeskai Oculus can do to make it a little bit more dominant in the matchup. And so going into certain matchups, we'll approach it with intention. And I think that is a super useful piece of advice. A couple of other good pieces of advice that I got were to utilize your time with the people that you're working with efficiently. Learn how to communicate your thoughts efficiently. This is something that I'm working on a lot. For example, with Esper Pixie, I was winning a lot more with the deck than some of my other friends were winning in testing. And so I spent a lot of time trying to communicate what I might be doing differently, communicate what I thought, and find the best way to translate that in a way that helps the group come to a large set of conclusions. And so finding a good way to communicate with the people you're working with is also super useful. In addition to that, another piece of advice that was given was to, get a lot of reps, be very, very comfortable on the deck you play. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but getting a lot of reps and being comfortable on a deck is, super important. You are going to be playing in a tournament, presuming it's a regional championship, with a lot of rounds. Monday, the first day is 9 rounds. By the end of my first tournament, like my 9th round, I wasn't thinking anymore. And so the brain is a muscle. You can train it. You can, create muscle memory for yourself, heuristics, things like that, that make your tournament easier. And you get those things by playing a lot of games intentionally. It's not super useful to sit and play ladder for 5 hours in the middle of the night because you're not going to retain any of that information. You're not going to be, applying or really thinking thoughtfully about those games. So as many, intentional, thoughtful games that you can get, I think that is a super important part of prep. All right, with that, I hope all of this information was useful for you and helps you achieve your goals at the next tournament you go to, maybe the regional championship in Minneapolis this weekend, or if Hartford is a little closer to you, in a couple of weeks. If there are any questions you have, please feel free to leave them below. I love when people leave comments and, ask questions. One of my favorite parts of Magic is improving and getting better and being thoughtful on the process, and you'll notice that's true of a lot of players that play at the highest level, and so those are conversations I love to have. And following this weekend in Minneapolis, I'll probably post another video where I take this process that I just talked to you guys about, and I'll show you what that meant for us once deck lists have been posted and tournament results are out. And we'll talk about, how we can learn from those tournament results, whether they're good or bad. And so, if you're not subscribed, that's one of the best ways you can support me. Follow the rest of this content. Liking, commenting is always super useful. And if you want to step up your game a little further than that, in the description is a link to my Metafy. On my Metafy, I post, deck guides, I talk about other things that I'm learning, and you can also schedule coaching if that is something you're interested in. And so, with that, I will see you guys through the rest of the kind of prep videos I post throughout the week, and I will, keep you posted.